Welcome to the debate. Welcome to ADR or our premium Abooze deep dive. I'm your host, Jennifer Tony. And well, if you've ever stood in an anechoic chamber, one of those completely soundproof rooms used for acoustic testing, you notice something deeply unsettling. The absolute absence of external noise doesn't actually bring peace, right?
I'm your co-host, David. And yeah, that's so true. You just start hearing your own heartbeat, the rush of blood in your ears. Most people actually panic in those rooms within minutes because, well, silence is incredibly loud.
Right. They literally beg to be let out just to drown out their own internal frequency. But then there are the rare few who stay in the room, who, listen to that overwhelming quiet and decide to orchestrate it.
And that perfectly brings us to today's focus. We're looking at the artistic evolution of the Afrobeats artist Abooze, specifically how he navigates profound internal struggles against the backdrop of his massive public rise.
Spot on. Based on the essay Abooze, Turning Silence into Sound, I'll be arguing that his music is a deliberate alchemy. It's an active, forceful mechanism to convert silent personal pain into a powerful, loud legacy.
And I look at that exact same evolution and see a completely different mechanism at play. I'll argue that Abooze's artistry acts fundamentally as a mirror that balances joy and grief. It's an act of preserving vulnerability, offering resonance rather than some, simplistic, aggressive triumph over his struggle.
But hey, before we really get into the weeds, if you're an independent artist seeking validation, or just a fan of deep music culture, make sure you hit subscribe and join the AD community down in the comments.
We really love hearing your takes. So to truly understand Abooze, especially the mechanics of his internal growth, we have to look at the beginning, right? We are looking at a young man who did not arrive loudly. He carried what the text calls oceans inside him.
Yeah, and having oceans inside you is dangerous. Psychologically speaking, it can lead to drowning. I mean, his isolation literally felt like drowning while standing still. That's why I think he used his music as an evolutionary tool to ensure pain didn't have the final word. He purposefully forged the destructive elements of his life into something undeniable.
I mean, I hear that. I understand the appeal of the whole pain to power narrative, but framing his music merely as a transition completely overlooks the actual psychological reality of his work. For him, silence was never empty, it was memory, it was survival.
But is it just survival? Think about the independent artists listening right now. If we tell them the only way to validate their struggle is just to sit with it, doesn't that take away their agency? I feel like Abooze aggressively forged his pain into a weapon for industry success.
See, I think that loses the essence of what makes Abooze so rare. He doesn't eradicate the pain to get to the power. His artistry serves as a safe frequency for people who feel deeply but suffer quietly. It's not just a hurdle he jumped over to get to the top of the charts. That vulnerability is the actual atmosphere of his music.
Okay, but let's talk about that atmosphere. You mentioned that his silence was survival, which is true. But there's a very sharp dividing line between his silent internal wars and the calm confidence he projects now. The silence was just his preparation phase.
Preparation for what, though?
For taking control. Think about Afrobeats. It's historically driven by high-energy polyrhythms, physical movement, and celebration. He takes that kinetic framework and injects it with heavy emotional truths. He's actively using the rhythm to literally push the pain forward.
Yeah, but he isn't replacing the silence with that rhythm. He is embodying the silence within it. Listen to how he structures his tracks. Traditional Afrobeats production layers auxiliary percussion like shakers and congas to fill every available frequency.
Right, it's usually very, very dense.
Precisely. But Abooze does the exact opposite. He hollows out the middle of the track. He uses negative acoustic space, leaving the bass line minimal so his vocal sits isolated. He gives the quiet a rhythm so it can finally be heard by those silent dreamers listening.
That's a brilliant way to describe his production style, actually. But I think your interpretation of why he hollows out the track gets to the core of our disagreement here. It's the difference between a forge and a sanctuary.
A forge? How so?
I see that sparse musical architecture as a forge. He takes the raw iron of his internal struggles, strips away the distracting commercial percussion, and hammers that emotion into the steel of a loud legacy. You view it as a sanctuary, where heavy emotions just find a safe place to rest.
Well, the problem with the forge analogy is that a forge burns away impurities to create something entirely new, something hard and impenetrable. If he had truly forged his pain into steel, the pain would be gone. It would just be armor.
But power implies heat, right? It implies kinetic energy. It implies the raw material of his suffering has been altered into an engine for his rise.
Not always. His authenticity is powerful precisely because it doesn't try to neatly resolve the scars. His sound never pretends the pain didn't exist. He doesn't offer a triumphant beat drop that signals he has beaten his depression. The power you're talking about isn't a sword. It's the power of gravity. It's an undeniable, steady presence.
I get the gravity point. I do. But let's look at the mechanics of what he is actually doing. He doesn't just sit with his wounds in a room. He turns wounds into wisdom and scars into stories. That act of translation requires massive internal growth.
It does require growth, no doubt about that.
Right. And it dictates a very specific public output. For an aspiring artist, it's terrifying to feel like you're drowning in isolation. And Abooze takes that feeling and structures it into melody. That is an act of taking immense control over chaos. By making music that makes people feel, he's dictating the terms.
I completely agree that he takes the narrative back. Where we diverge is on the nature of that momentum. Let's look at the industry context, which is crucial here. The modern music industry demands that trauma be neatly packaged into an inspiring, consumable arc, right?
Oh, absolutely. Everything has to be a neat little victory anthem for streaming.
Exactly. And Abooze resists that entirely. He lives in a world dominated by performance, exaggeration, and temporary trends. But his response isn't to create a louder performance. His response is just realness. He doesn't use his pain to perform or seek validation.
But that resistance is precisely why his method is so revolutionary and active. By turning his pain into timeless art, he stands in direct combative contrast to that world of exaggeration. He didn't just find truth. He weaponized it against the artificiality of the industry.
Whoa, I have to stop you at the word weaponized. Notice the qualities that actually define his sound. He doesn't use force. His strength is described in the text as steady and soulful. He treats his artistry as a sanctuary, completely insulating himself from the very battles you say he's fighting.
I'm just not convinced by that. Mostly because it downplays the sheer ambition required to rise in this landscape. You don't become unforgettable by accident. It requires deliberate, active projection. Abooze deliberately turned emotion into movement.
Movement, sure, but not necessarily a calculated offensive maneuver.
But movement implies trajectory. It implies that the internal realization was the fuel that propelled his industry rise. He synthesized his suffering into something beautiful instead of letting it remain destructive. That is an incredible act of emotional engineering.
Emotional engineering feels way too clinical for the grace of what Abooze is actually doing, though. An engineer builds something outside of themselves. But Abooze doesn't just make the music, he becomes it. He becomes the frequency.
Okay, but what's the takeaway for the independent artists listening to us right now? What do they do with that?
The lesson isn't to figure out how to engineer your sadness into a highly optimized hit song. The lesson is to be so undeniably rooted in your own truth, to let your own silence breathe so deeply that the world has no choice but to stop and listen. It is a profound surrender to authenticity, not an engineering of it.
That is a beautiful sentiment. But a frequency still has an amplitude. It still has to be broadcast. Growth is inherently active. He conquered the isolation of silence by actively translating it into a musical language everyone could understand.
I hear you focusing heavily on terms like conquered and translated, but his story is proof that silence is not a weakness that needs to be defeated. Sometimes the quietest seasons naturally create the loudest legacies. The deepest voices are born from the quietest struggles.
Coexisting with the pain, essentially.
Exactly. His music is for hearts that carry both scars and hope. Notice the coexistence there? Not scars that were magically turned into hope. Both exist at the same time. He doesn't fix the human condition, he just finally gives it an honest, unfiltered soundtrack.
Well, as we step back and look at the entirety of his journey, my position remains that Abooze's music is a profound evolutionary force. He took the massive weight of silent struggles, the isolation, the unanswered questions, and actively transformed them, hammering raw pain into an unforgettable artistic legacy.
And my stance remains that his true genius lies in his quiet strength and profound resonance. He provides a rare, authentic musical mirror where joy and grief are allowed to coexist. By refusing to perform his pain for validation, he became a steady frequency that heals rather than a weapon that conquers.
I think where we absolutely converge, though, is on the understanding that Abooze represents a desperately needed alternative to the modern music industry's obsession with spectacle. His authenticity cuts through the noise of temporary trends.
Completely agreed. His truth, wrapped in melody, is a much-needed antidote to an industry built on illusion and fake smiles. Where we continue to disagree is whether his art is a deliberate mechanism to transform pain into power or a quiet space that simply reflects the complex reality of being human.
It really highlights the value of looking closely at how artists process the world. When we press play, are we looking for a battle plan or are we looking for a mirror? Listeners will have to explore Abooze's unique frequency for themselves.
Spot on. You'll have to listen to the space between the beats. And hey, let us know in the comments, what do you hear in his silence? Make sure to like, subscribe, and keep supporting ADD.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep listening, and we'll see you on the next debate.